My name is Claire Haley. I'm the Vice President of Public Relations and Programs here for Atlanta History Center, and welcome to Atlanta History Center's virtual Author Talk series. This talk, as I mentioned earlier, was supposed to be in person, but given the inclement winter weather, we decided to move it to virtual, which seems to have been the right decision. So we really appreciate you jumping over onto Zoom with us this afternoon. This talk is being recorded and will be made available on YouTube afterwards. It's also going to be on the AIB network. So even if folks aren't able to join us right now, they'll have a chance to see this great conversation later. Today we are joined by Deanna Gillespie. She is the author of a new book that just came out from the University of Florida Press, and it is called The Citizenship Education Project, the Citizenship Education Program and Black Women's Political Culture. Sorry, bit of a tongue twister there. It is an exploration of the Citizenship Education Project, an effort that was eventually adopted into the SCLC to help people be able to pass a literacy test prior to those being outlawed by civil rights legislation in the 1960s. Dee is a professor of U.S. history at the University of North Georgia. Her research teaching focuses on women's history, social movements, and Southern history in the mid to late 20th century. She has been published in both the Journal of Southern History and the Georgia Historical Quarterly. She's in conversation this afternoon with Kristian Weatherspoon. Kristian is on staff here with Atlanta History Center. She's our Vice President of Digital Storytelling. Before joining the Atlanta History Center, she had a 10-year career in digital journalism, taking her from her home state of Mississippi and all over other parts of the South. So Dee and Kristian, thank you both so much for being here today.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining us. Hi, Dee. Wonderful to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah, really excited to be here for this conversation. So I won't beat around the bush. We'll go ahead and dig in. As Claire mentioned, the book explores the Citizen Education Program. Extremely fascinating to really see this story and understand kind of the inner workings of this program, kind of nestled within the civil rights movement. So let me begin at, as a historian, why was this topic so interesting and pertinent for you?
Well, thank you. And let me say thank you for the invitation to be here today. Thank you to the Atlanta History Center, and thanks to everybody who made this move online for us. The topic of the Citizenship Education Program was interesting to me, not only as a historian, but because of some professional work that I had done before I went to get a PhD in history. So I haven't always been a historian. I started my career as a social worker in Atlanta. And my last job in that field was in the middle of the 1990s. I worked for an organization called the Family Connection. And my job with the Family Connection was to drive around the state of Georgia and talk with folks about if you really wanted to make change in your community and improve conditions for children and families, that it'd be a good idea if you talked with those children and families and included them in your planning and your implementation and your evaluation of those programs, so that the conversation wouldn't only be well-meaning professionals sitting around a table, but you're including those community members in those conversations and in actually delivering those services. And as I drove around the state and talked with folks about that, they, of course, talked with me about their communities. And I got to meet some really fabulous local community leaders, women who were doing remarkable work, not because they had a credential that said that they could get a job to do it, and not because they were earning a salary to do it, but because they were committed to it. And I also heard about the history of those communities and really kind of realized I'm much more interested in what these places looked like 50 years ago than now. And because I think that history informs where they are now. So I went back to graduate school to retool to get a PhD in history and be a historian with that kind of mindset and that kind of idea of community leadership and Southern communities in particular, and women's role in those communities. And this program, the Citizenship Education Program, I still am not quite sure how it landed in my lap, but it did. It came across in something I read, and I was lucky enough to find a huge amount of resources, primary sources at the King Center and eventually at Emory University that really tell the story of this program. So that's why it was interesting to me. It got at the very issues and topics and kind of local community dynamics that I really wanted to look at and examine.
So you mentioned, you mentioned in the introduction, to the book that it's basically, written as a series of case studies, which was a really interesting, way to frame it. Talk to me just about the Citizen Education Program. And I can't help but think that to talk about what it was, you have to really understand, the contentious and terrible, times, during that period. So give me some background about that.
Sure. So the Citizenship Education Program began in 1957 on the Sea Islands of South Carolina, and eventually spreads to communities across the South. And the idea was, at a very basic level, to teach basic literacy lessons for local African Americans to empower them to be able to pass the literacy test that was required for voter registration and was disproportionately applied to African Americans trying to register to vote in southern states. But the broader goal of the program was an understanding that if you knew how to read and write, it would not only empower you to vote, but it would also give you skills and tools that would be essential in anything that you did, that it can improve more broadly your life as an individual as well as the life of the community. So the Citizenship Education Program classes were a blend of basic literacy skills toward the goal of voter registration, but also really worked as a crash course in political education. So all of the literacy lessons were framed around government and how government functions, the role of citizens in a participatory democracy. And so again, working as a crash course in political education and civic education. And then part of the goal of the program also was, when you get these folks together and they are working together to learn these things over the course of 3 months, and they're getting together twice a week, that they're going to talk about local issues as well. And so the idea was to seed local leadership, to convince folks that you are in fact a leader, you're capable of being a leader, and to then kind of build that community group that could move forward to improve basic things in that community. And again, empowering them with the knowledge of how government works. Where are those pressure points, and how do you as an individual citizen or group weigh in at particular points to get your goals and your priorities met? So that was basically the goal and the structure of the program. And like I said, it spread to local communities across the South. First the Highlander Folk School and then the Southern Christian Leadership Conference identified local leaders who they brought to a local training, a central training site, trained them in how to deliver this curriculum. And then those leaders spread out back across the South, back home, and opened these classes, organized these classes.
Before we get into, the specific women, many of whom you name and talk about in depth, that I want to hear about that. You mentioned citizenship, and there is a recurring term around first class citizenship that you talk about in the book that I think is really interesting in exploring, so many things. Explain to me, what place that term specifically had in these programs.
Yeah, it's actually a tension point in the program. So on one level, that idea of first class citizenship in a lot of ways kind of imposed what might be considered to be kind of middle class norms, right? So being able to read and write, presenting yourself a certain way, speaking a certain way, and really kind of, like I said, carrying yourself in a particular way, which in some ways implies that if you're not doing those things, then it's wrong or improper or some other kind of judgment about the way that you're presenting yourself. And for African Americans in southern states, particularly in the Jim Crow South, that presentation became part of the justification for segregation, that this was a marker of being less than, of being inferior. So in some ways, the program is kind of enforcing a particular idea of respectability, and that you present yourself in a way so that you are treated with that respect. But also the program taught practical skills that were not only about how you present yourself, that learning how to read and write was a way to establish yourself as an individual, that you weren't dependent on other people anymore. You had this skill to be able to read things on your own, get your own information, to be able to read just on a very basic level, read letters from family members rather than having your employer read them to you. Because once the employer reads them to you, then the employer is part of your family business, kind of is in your life in a way that could be uncomfortable. On a very basic level, learning how to read and write meant you could sign your own name, which identified you as an individual, and an individual who commanded respect, as opposed to an X that really removed that respect and that individual identity. And so the program was always kind of a blend of both of those things. This kind of implied notion that the way that you behave is a part of citizenship and a way of earning those rights, but also on a very practical level, arming folks with the skills that they could make use of to really be a first-class citizen, and to define what that meant for themselves, to have more ability to define what that meant for themselves.
Absolutely. As I mentioned, you talk a lot about, you give a lot of information and names specifically of women instrumental in this work. It was so refreshing and enlightening and just interesting to see, because again, many of the names you never hear, you've never heard, which I think is an issue we'll get into a little bit later. And talk to me about some of those women and who they were.
Sure. So they were women that we probably know in our communities, and so they were women who were well known in their communities, but like you're saying, weren't well known to us. The first citizenship school teacher has certainly got a lot of recognition in the scholarship about this program. And her name was Bernice Robinson. She was a hairdresser and a seamstress in Charleston. And when the program, kind of the folks that were putting the program together, pointed to her and said, "We need you to be the first teacher," she said, "I don't know anything about what you're talking about, and I can't do it." And they said, "Yes, you can, and we're sure you can." And she did. Other women that were part of the early citizenship schools on the Sea Islands came with some more background that was kind of more pertinent to this work. So Ethel Grimball was an early teacher on Wadmalaw Island, and she was the daughter of a local community activist. She was a school teacher by training who had been kind of pushed out of the school system with the kind of post-Brown v. Board of Education purges that happened in southern states. Another woman, Aileen Brewer, was a local school citizenship school teacher on neighboring Edisto Island, and she was a trained social worker, so kind of applied that training in the citizenship schools. As the program spread across the South, it really cast a wide net, and so other women like Pearlie Ely joined and agreed to organize classes in Southeast Georgia. Pearlie Ely lived in Tatnall County, which is a rural county outside of Savannah. She was a recent high school graduate, had been valedictorian of her class in her segregated school, and really didn't have a lot of options, despite the fact that she was a valedictorian. And so she saw organizing these classes as a way to apply the education that she'd gotten, but also to improve the community, to strengthen that community, empower that community, and use the skills that she had to do that. Like I said, the program spread across the South and the Mississippi Delta. Other women who were hairdressers and active in their churches got actively involved in the program. Women like Alice Blackwell in Greenwood, Mississippi. Victoria Gray Adams in Hattiesburg, Mississippi is a name that I think is maybe more familiar to those who know civil rights scholarship. But she found an open door and kind of came into SCLC through the Citizenship Education Program. And then in the Alabama Black Belt, the last case study that I look at, there were women who got involved in that spring campaign of March 1965, so had been central to providing support for the folks that came in for the March to Montgomery, and then saw the Citizenship Education Program classes as a way to extend their work beyond that event in March 1965. So it really was a blend of women who were already very skilled community organizers, had professional training that lent itself to this work, but also women who in some ways used this program as a way to build that professional training and then moved on to apply the training they got through this program in other helping professions.
I know we talked earlier, in preparation for this about kind of the informal power structures that existed within communities, and how, these stories are kind of wonderful examples of women kind of working with, within and around, around those kind of unspoken, power structures. In a very stealth way, might I add, to get things done. And, I think that makes the story, that much more interesting. I guess, talk to me a little bit about how kind of that hierarchy, that we talked about was just indicative of that time.
So the work of teaching citizenship schools was really seen as women's work, because by the time we get to the 1950s, teaching had become a feminized profession. For African American women in particular, it was one of the few professions that was open for African American women. And so as local leaders stepped into this role as citizenship school teachers, they were doing what was unfamiliar work, but it was familiar. It was familiar that women would be doing this work, that community work was, like I said, already kind of seen as women's work. And so, like you're saying, those women were very effective then in mobilizing the networks that they were already a part of. Mm-hmm. and identifying people to come to classes through those networks, gathering support for the work they were doing through those networks, and then being able to kind of funnel more people into teaching these citizenship schools through those networks. So and the program in some ways gives us insight into what those networks look like, because as other scholars have written about, and like you're pointing out, they're hidden from view in a lot of ways. And this program and the records that are left behind give us a way to shine a light into that aspect of these communities.
Can I take a point here? I mean, I think it's so interesting, and you kind of the gathering of all of these, these materials and primary sources. What was that process, Dee?
It was long. A lot of time spent hunched over a table, either at the King Center or at Emory University. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference collection is housed in primarily in two different places, at the King Center in Atlanta and at Emory University. And luckily for me, and for reasons that I don't fully understand, the staff of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference saved a whole lot of these records. And so I should mention the program was funded through foundation funds, through mainly from the Field Foundation, which was a private philanthropic foundation of the Marshall Field department stores in Chicago. And so part of that foundation funding, any of us that work with grant funds know there's reporting that goes along with that, and you've got to have documentation. So that meant that these local teachers had to record and document what they were doing. So there are boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of attendance records, monthly attendance records that don't document every single class, but there's a whole bunch of them. And on those records, it has the teacher's name, the location, not only the town, but where. So if it was a church, the actual church where that class happened, or in the teacher's home, the list of students who came for that month, their age, how many were registered to vote, how many were not registered to vote. And then for me, the gold was there's a small space for comments where teachers could write their reflections about the month that they had spent in that class. And so cumulatively, the information comes in frustratingly small little pieces, but it makes a complete story, all of these little pieces. So that was a lot of the main research that I did. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference collection also includes cumulative reports that administrators wrote for the foundation that kind of gave a bigger picture view of this program. So those were also useful. And I had in mind when I started the project that I was going to drive all over the South and find all of these women that had taught these classes, and they would be happy to talk with me. And that would be kind of the treasure trove of the sources that I was going to use. And so I spent time at the King Center making my lists and, having all Excel spreadsheets with all these names and all these places. And it turns out it's harder than I thought it was going to be to find these women for a number of different reasons. By the time I started the program in the early 2000s, many of them had passed away because they had been in their 50s or 60s when they did this work in the 1960s. Many of them had moved away from the place that I had on my records and didn't really leave a path that I could follow. They married and changed their names, doggone it, and then it made it harder for me to find them. So I did what I could in terms of oral histories. I also mined other oral histories done by other historians who had gotten there before I did. So I didn't get to ask the questions that I wanted to, but as a part of those oral history interviews, there was some information about this woman teaching a citizenship school class. So I could use that information. Those oral history interviews also helped me to fill in a bigger picture, because all I had was kind of this snapshot of what she did in this moment. But those oral history interviews really kind of filled in details on either end, what she did before and what she did after. So those were the main sources that I used to piece this story together. And like I say in the book, my goal wasn't to overwhelm readers with names, but I did want to put in as many names as I could, because like you're saying, these are people who did important work that they knew was important at the time. The people in those classes knew it was important at the time, but haven't necessarily been carried forward into the historical record.
It's amazing. Yeah, because it was amazing to see, piece these things together and kind of piece these stories together. As I think about, not to give too much of the book away for those on the chat who have not read it, you absolutely, need to read it. But I do want to hit a bit kind of on the tension that the book, covers. Of course, once the program is integrated and absorbed into the SCLC in later years, and kind of the tension around it trying to maintain its identity, and the women, trying to their identity around this program but go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry, you were cutting out a little bit. Can you ask the question again?
Oh, sorry.
That's
No,
okay.
I don't want to, give it away, but I want to touch on the tension that the book explores kind of as the program is absorbed into the SCLC, and, the journey, that, these women go through to be sure that the program maintains its identity, as they, basically created it. And, being honest, kind of what that tension was between, the men and women.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was, of course, Martin Luther King's organization. That's the way that we think about it. And it was an organization that brought very creative and intelligent and strong-willed Black male ministers together in Atlanta. Some of them were full-time staff members. Some served on the board of directors for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So we tend to think of King as kind of embodying that organization, but in the 1960s, he was certainly recognized as a leader of the organization, but was surrounded by men who, in their own right, were very kind of strong-willed and, like I said, creative, intelligent people who were committed to this cause and had their own ideas about what needed to happen to achieve the goals of the movement. The Citizenship Education Program comes to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, not necessarily because that organization went looking for it, and not necessarily because the organization saw it as they wouldn't have created it on their own if it hadn't come to them. At the time, the Highlander Folk School, that had been the home for the kind of the administrative home for this program, was under suspicion for communist activities, what were perceived and suspected communist activities. So there was more heat under that organization. Also, Miles Horton, the director, was concerned about the program growing as fast as it was, and was really looking to offload the Citizenship Education Program to another organization. And the Southern Christian Leadership Conference agreed to take it on. Because the program had its own independent funding and had a staff that kind of came along with it from Highlander, the SCLC didn't necessarily position the program as central to its programming. And in some ways, this was not necessarily a bad thing, because it meant that the program could kind of operate on its own, separate from whatever internal dynamics may be going on and whatever kind of jockeying there may be going on in the SCLC over whose idea is going to be the one that we follow. But it also meant that the CEP, the Citizenship Education Program, was always kind of marginalized within SCLC. And in part because it was seen as women's work. And in that time and in that organization, the way that the CEP was perceived was the same way that a woman's auxiliary would be perceived within a local church, that this was important work and it was vital to the church and its well-being and the congregation, but maybe not as front and center as activities led by the minister or led by the board of deacons that were typically men. And so there was a tension there within the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It's also, I think, important to keep in mind that we're talking about a period when a women's movement is also kind of running concurrent to the civil rights movement and really comes in its own in the late 1960s and 1970s. So it's that informs a consciousness about these gender issues. So our kind of evaluation of the gender dynamics in a lot of ways is informed by that women's movement that hadn't necessarily brought all of those gendered questions kind of front and center in the time period that we're talking about when the CEP was most active.
I think you explore, and you mentioned in our previous conversation around although women predominantly were teachers within the program, there were men who facilitated classes, and how there were subtle differences within that. Talk about that.
That's right. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference also operated on an affiliate basis. And so local churches or local groups could affiliate with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So it's a little bit different than a group like the NAACP that had its own chapters. Instead, the local group maintained its own kind of identity, but it was just connected to the SCLC. But that affiliation meant that there was a connection there. And in some communities, local Black ministers decided that they would get trained to teach this citizenship school class. It also tapped into church-based networks, which is where a lot of women who taught citizenship schools kind of come into the program through those church-based networks. And the records kind of tell us that the classes that men led were different from the classes that women led. There was just a different leadership style. There was a different way of communicating, a different way of kind of delivering the curriculum, that the men who taught classes kind of saw it more as, I'm going to tell you what you need to know, and then you're going to go and follow instructions. And with women who taught the classes, there seemed to be more of a kind of a give and take or a collaborative spirit to the classes.
Absolutely. Again, the book takes us from, South Carolina into, Mississippi, into Alabama, into, a number of places,
Mm-hmm.
where the programs, worked. And, talk a little bit, Dee, about, kind of the sustainability of this program and how, these stories, specifically, talk about and illustrate to us kind of just the intense work that it took then and still, takes now to maintain and sustain an effort that was as successful as this.
Right. So there's a lot of pieces that come together to explain why this program was able to operate for 10 years. First of all, the technical expertise. So Septima Clark from Charleston is kind of the constant thread throughout the entire program's history. She was instrumental in getting the program kind of implanted on the Sea Islands, along with a local leader named Esau Jenkins. So that you've got a local school teacher, Septima Clark, who's got the kind of professional training, the pedagogical training, along with a local leader who is well connected in that community, and the synergy between those two. The bringing in of the Highlander Folk School gave the program access to resources like foundation funding. Miles Horton, the director of the Highlander Folk School, was well connected to networks outside of both within the South and outside the South, so was able to kind of pull those strings. And if you're going to run a program like this, you need money. And so the Highlander Folk School became a conduit, not only for kind of technical assistance, but also for foundation money. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference then becomes the administrative home, so that as these local classes are going on, there's a hub, there's a central kind of organizing point. And that's also helpful in this kind of effort, that these local teachers aren't just operating on their own, but there's a central hub there that's kind of keeping its eye on the prize and keeping everybody moving in the same direction. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was not set up to take in its own funds, but managed through a partnership with the United Board of Christian Ministries to funnel resources to local teachers. So local teachers who taught classes received a stipend of $30 a month, as well as got reimbursed for expenses. And it doesn't seem like a lot to us, but for many of those teachers, it was a lifeline to money that wasn't connected to local employers. So you could do this work and still have some money coming into the house. So all of those pieces have to come together, and there needs to be an overall environment to support this work. It's useful that there's a larger, broader movement that this work fits into, so that when these women did this work, it wasn't just them doing it on their own, that folks were aware that we're all working toward a bigger goal, and that things like the Birmingham campaign of 1963, the March on Washington in 1963, that all of these other smaller movements, the sit-in movements that college students were involved in the early part of the 1960s, were all moving in the same direction. So that helps to bring people into local classes. And if we think about, again, all of those pieces that need to fit together, it, I think, helps to inform the way that we think about how change happens now, that it's necessary to have identified leadership. It's necessary to have kind of a central organizing hub that's helpful, but also have reach out into local communities, mobilizing local leaders, the people in communities that people already trust, right? So that you're not attempting to build that trust, but you can connect what you're trying to do to that local leadership and mobilize folks on a local level. Make it personal to them, make it so that whatever the priorities are set by them, and they're mobilized and motivated to work toward those goals that are all linked to a larger goal. And then the resources, again, if you're going to have a movement, it's helpful to have money. The ability to communicate widely is also helpful. And then just basic political will, having a political system that is willing to change, willing to reform, willing to act in response to that movement. And again, I think kind of examining the way these things work in the past or don't work in the past can help us to think about how things do or don't work today.
I mean, it was, again, absolutely fascinating. You know, in the later part, again, not to give too much of the book away, but when you explore kind of the emergence of larger figures, Ella Baker, you discuss Fannie Lou Hamer and her involvement, and how the program, was able to successfully make the jump from, kind of sheer voting into a political space, to really have that type of influence. And it just, it says a lot that, this program undergirded a lot of that movement. I have one question in the chat right now. It says from Bridget Denton, one of the most powerful photos is on page 171 of Septima Clark teaching an older man to write his own name, which is both hopeful and raw. To think that some people wanted those with brown skin to be kept away from the basic human education is distressing. Do you think there's room today for a CEP in society?
Yes. Yes is the answer to that. And I think it's, again, you've got to line up all of those pieces that I just talked about. And that can be a difficult thing, especially if you're thinking very broadly. So, and I think there are ways to make this work locally, and finding ways to take perhaps pieces of this program and fold them into existing programs that are going on, existing services, to kind of think about how perhaps adult education is currently delivered and folding in this civics piece of it, so that adult education includes, like I said before, a crash course in political education and what it means to be an active citizen in a participatory democracy. Like I told my students this past week in class, being a citizen in this country shouldn't be a spectator sport. But I think for many of us, there's questions about, then how do I move out of the stands onto the field? Right. And so I think there are already existing kind of places and where that could be folded in.
I want to talk a little bit more about, you explore, so much kind of around citizenship, but the community aspect was also really interesting about, again, about teaching kind of those life skills. Some of the schools taught sewing or, a number of things, and how it was just such a boost of morale in communities. And talk a little bit about kind of what that, how that worked.
Well, in some communities, like you're pointing out, the teachers brought their own skills into the classroom. And so had sewing circles for the women in the classes. And as a result, it gave the women kind of social hour, social time, where they could sit around and do women's work, but also for young women who came into those classes who weren't as well skilled in those trades. It gave them skills that they could then use and market. In other communities, these community groups decide that they're going to take on long-standing markers of segregation. And so there's a lot of evidence of these groups taking on issues like getting playgrounds for their kids to play on, safe places for their kids to play, so they're not playing in the street or playing in some place that's not safe. That if children on the other side of the tracks had those things, then our children should have them too. Paved roads, sewer systems that were not open ditches, and having mail delivered directly to the house instead of having to go to maybe a post office made a difference in these people's lives. And again, they can seem to be perhaps trivial things to us in the grand scheme of things, but they're daily things that make a difference. And visually, it removes the markers of segregation. It meant that when you drove through these towns, that the communities looked the same. You didn't look at different parts of town and say that must be where these folks live and that must be where these other folks live. And so organizing and pushing city governments or county governments that had not been responsive in the past to address these longstanding issues. And I think, as I was working on the book, I initially saw these things. And again, I thought, well, isn't that nice? But aren't they focused on this bigger issue of voting? But as I saw it over and over and over and over again, it also just kind of hit me that we're talking about the 1960s, and we're talking about places like Savannah and North Charleston, and Greenwood, Mississippi. All these places are not out in the sticks.
Right. And
yet these communities are still marked by roads that flood and turn to mud when it rains, that the sewer system is not modern in any way. And so it just, again, kind of highlights the long-term legacy of segregation on so many different levels. The picture that my friend Bridget was referring to in her question in the Q&A also tells us about the long-term legacy of underfunded, under-resourced, segregated schools, that there were generations of African-American men and women who didn't have basic literacy skills in the 1960s. And the Brown v. Board of Education ruling in 1954 that declared segregated schools unconstitutional held out a promise for future generations, but didn't necessarily do anything to address this long legacy and these folks that didn't have these skills. So in a lot of ways, the CEP kind of steps into that breach as well and provides a way for folks to get these basic skills without having to go to an adult education class where you have to admit to everybody that you don't know how to read. You can sit with people that you know and you trust and gain these basic skills.
Absolutely. I have another question. You mentioned that not only teachers were recruited into the effort. Can you talk more about why it was important to recruit others, such as the hairdresser and other folks into the CEP?
Sure. Well, first of all, I gave the program broader reach so that it wasn't only a program that teachers could do, because once you do that, then you're limiting the number of people that you could potentially use as teachers. The program was also based on the idea of kind of collaborative learning, that this was not going to be a class where folks came in, sat down, and then a teacher stood in front of them, told them what they needed to know. That instead it was going to be a sharing and learning kind of environment in that way. And it carries over from the model that Miles Horton had developed at the Highlander Folk School that I talk more about in the book. But it was also important to reach out to other people in the community because they were the folks who had had the ability to teach these classes without putting everything on the line. So when we talk about Black women beauticians teaching these classes, they had an income that was separate from white employers in town. So that when they taught these classes, if they came under scrutiny, if they came under suspicion, and there was some retribution, it's harder to hit that teacher where it hurts in the billfold, in the wallet, in the purse, because her income is dependent on the Black community, not dependent on a white employer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
My final question for you, Dee, is the book obviously explores the legacy of, as you mentioned, Jim Crow and segregation. What is it, what's a final thought around, what this book truly says about just the legacy of women and fortitude and their determination?
Well, it's a big question. I think that I hope that the book, like I said, shines a light into things that are there that we don't see and don't necessarily recognize as political action. So that these networks exist and had existed for as long as there had been communities in Southern states, and that women had been central to that. Women leadership had been central to that. So I hope the book shines a light on those networks. And again, the political work that those women were doing, that this wasn't just what women do, and it wasn't just kind of nice community work, that it was political work that they were doing and continue to do today. I hope that the book also gives a snapshot and an examination of that leadership in different places. In civil rights scholarship, there's more work about women leadership now, certainly, than there was 20 years ago. A lot of that scholarship either focuses on one woman or focuses on one organization or focuses on one place. And this program, because it existed in so many different places and drew in so many different kinds of women into it, it allows a way for us to see the breadth of women's leadership and the breadth of women's community work, as you're saying, that really ran in the background of the civil rights movement. I want to make sure to say that this program was not the only thing like this. So it's one of a number of programs like this, sponsored by a number of different organizations that drew in local women. So I don't want to leave folks with the idea that this was the most important thing ever. It's one of many things that happened in the background, and I think a significant and important thing that happened in the background.
Which is, again, also fascinating as you explore, the freedom schools within the book, and how, again, building upon the work of CEP and how it really was kind of the bedrock on top of which, the education portion of freedom school was built. When it was, again, supremely fascinating.
That's right. We historians are really at an early stage of exploring the connections between these things. So it took some time for us to find the things. And now we're exploring more of those connections and finding out that these folks in the 1960s didn't have social media and they didn't have the modern technology that we have, but they were pretty good at communicating with each other, and they knew who was who.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. One more, aside from the role of teachers, do you have any idea of the role of women in this organization compared to that of women in other civil rights organizations?
It wasn't much different. Okay. So the part of the reason why the CEP is kind of treated the way it is in the SCLC is because that's kind of how women's women's participation in other organizations was at the time. So, for example, the NAACP, there were certainly women that were active in the NAACP, but in a lot of ways their work was seen as women's work and not necessarily in the same way that Black male leadership was seen in the NAACP. There were, however, women-led organizations that were active in the civil rights movement. So the national, I'm going to get the name wrong, the National Negro Women's I wish I had it in front of me because I'm making a mess of this. But it was Mary McLeod Bethune's organization, is the one I'm talking about, that was very active in civil rights causes. Dorothy Height then becomes very active through that organization, and they had outreach into Southern communities doing similar work that the CEP was doing, and really tapping into those same networks that the CEP was tapping into, and many other women's organizations tied to churches that were doing important civil rights work in local communities.
Absolutely. One more question. I have a question here. I was moved by your comment on the final page of the book. Citizenship has some, it was something they did, not something they had. Would you speak further to how the history of CEP stands as an example of the power of democracy in the wider sweep of American history?
Sure. So I think it's the salient point for me about this program, that again, citizenship in a participatory democracy should not be a spectator sport, but it's got to be something that people connect to on a personal level. And so you can't have this kind of abstract goal that somebody doesn't connect to, that getting folks out of the stands and onto the playing field means finding those priorities, identifying those priorities that mean something to individuals and groups. And that requires reaching out into communities where people live their lives, connecting these broader goals to their daily priorities, and having those conversations. And again, it comes out of, I'll kind of circle back to where I started, it comes out of the work that I did in the 1990s, that sitting down and talking with those community leaders was eye-opening to me, because they were describing lives that were very different from the way that I had been brought up. And the dignity and the clear thinking about, this is what we want for our children and for our families, and the skills to know how to do it. When I would sit and say, I don't know how you're going to do that, they would say, well, we're going to do it this way. This is exactly how we're going to do it. And so tapping into those community leaders, and again, having those trusted folks in community be the ones to bring people out of the stands and onto the playing field, so that citizenship is something that you do. It's not a status that you carry around with you.
Wonderful. I think that's a wonderful place for us to wrap. Wonderful conversation. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dee. Wonderful book. I really appreciate the time today. And I'll turn it back over to Claire.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book. I appreciate, again, everybody who's made time this afternoon to join us here, and really appreciate, again, the interest in the book and this program.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Dee. As you were, excuse me, as you were talking, it's just, you know, so many of the issues you're articulating around citizenship education seem so relevant to us today. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. If you haven't yet read the book and you would like to get a copy, it is available directly from the University of Florida Press. So there's a link in the chat to do that. Be sure to use the code AHC22, and that'll give you a special discount on the book, as well as free shipping within the US. So if you haven't gotten your copy of the Citizenship Education Program in Black Women's Political Culture, that's the best way to do it. Again, this program was part of our Martin Luther King Jr. Day programming here at Atlanta History Center. We were all virtual today, so we really appreciate, Dee, your willingness to switch over to the virtual format and make this happen. Such a wonderful conversation. If you have tickets to tomorrow's program, please know that we are planning to continue on with the in-person program, but we'll communicate if there need to be any changes to the opening time in the morning, should there be ice on the roads or anything like that. So just keep an eye on your email and on our social media for any updates. If you'd like to attend more programming related to Martin Luther King Day, even if you don't have tickets to the program tomorrow, which are unfortunately sold out, there are several other things that we have to offer. I'm going to put a link in the chat. There's a virtual program tomorrow with Mary Frances Early. She was the first Black graduate of the University of Georgia, and she'll be discussing her new memoir called The Quiet Trailblazer. That is virtual, so plenty of seats left there. And we also have another author talk that evening with Art Dunning. It's just going to be a fantastic in-person program, and there are still a few tickets to that separate program available for tomorrow evening. So again, thank you all so much for commemorating Martin Luther King Jr. Day with us. Thank you, Dee, for being here virtually, Chris, for steering us through such a great conversation. And we hope to see you all either virtually or in person tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.